In this module, we're going to focus in on the budget of the United States and particularly take a look at the process for getting the budget in the United States, and then take a look at what money is spent on, and finish with a discussion of two of the bigger problems going forward in our spending habits, particularly interest on the national debt and Social Security. So, we have a system in the United States where the president comes up with a budget that he sends to Congress, and Congress then can ignore that budget, or Congress can go ahead and take the president's budget and use that as a baseline for what they're looking for. Oftentimes, it requires, you know, partisan differences being either abridged in some way to get ourselves a budget. If you're the president and you control both houses of Congress, you're better luck for your ability to be able to get things passed. Typically, the budget cycle at the federal level runs from October 1st to September 30th. So technically, at the end of the day at 11:59 and 59 seconds on September 30th, at the following day, the government doesn't really have any money to spend because it hasn't been appropriated by Congress. And we've had quite a few years recently where we didn't have a budget by then, in which case you may have heard the term continuing resolution. Both houses of Congress and the president will come up with some sort of budget plan to keep the government in operation for a couple of weeks until they can actually get a budget focused. But assuming everything works the way it's supposed to be, the budget is supposed to run from October 1st to September 30th. Now, what does this exactly mean? Well, there are 13 different appropriations bills that make up what we call the federal budget. And each of those is passed by both houses of Congress and goes to the president for the president's signature. And those 13 different appropriation bills are in various areas of policy. So, defense funding gets its own appropriations bill, agricultural funding gets its own appropriations bill, education, and so forth. And together, these 13 bills, when they're signed together, constitute the budget. Now, obviously, some of those things are more controversial than others. I mentioned that there are times in which we don't have a full federal budget passed. Sometimes some of those appropriations bills have been passed, and then they kind of just go into effective law, and then we pass the continuing resolutions to deal with the policy issues behind the areas that they have not been able to come to some resolution on. The president has the ability to be able to veto these appropriations bills, and that's subject to the normal veto override of Congress. Interestingly enough, most state governors in the United States have something called the line item veto power, which essentially means that they can take out individual portions of the budget, veto them, and if they are not overridden by their state legislatures, the money then gets taken out of the budget. We were in a time of fiscal austerity in the early 1990s. Budget deficits were very high. President Clinton, who was the former governor of Arkansas, kind of brought his executive branch gubernatorial hat on and decided that he would go along with Congress, and they passed the Line Item Veto Act, which gave this line item veto to the president. Again, for the first time, the president didn't have to veto the entire appropriations bill. He could just strike out parts of the bill that, for whatever reason, did not think that was a good use of federal funds. Well, the Supreme Court came along, and in the case Clinton versus the city of New York, basically ruled that the line item veto was unconstitutional. And they went back to something called the presentment clause, which essentially is that both houses of Congress present to the president a budget, and then the president has to sign that budget. And within that presentment clause and their interpretation of the presentment clause, adding this extra step of a line item veto was not in the intent of the framers, therefore it was unconstitutional. So as we stand right now, the president does not have the ability to be able to use line item veto and can only veto an entire appropriations bill. That may be changed in the future if we have a constitutional amendment, but can't be passed just by regular legislation. All right, so what are the categories of the federal budget? When we study it, there are essentially four major categories of the federal budget that we can look at: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, net interest on the federal debt, and then revenues. We're primarily for this module going to focus in on the first three. So, mandatory spending is generally in those areas that we consider to be entitlements. In other words, there are certain benefit programs that the federal government is obligated to provide people as long as they meet certain criteria. So, for example, our biggest source of mandatory spending is Social Security. So, the federal government is obligated by law to be able to provide people who have reached retirement age. It varies, but in general, for most people born in the last 50 or so years, full retirement age is 67. They are required to provide benefits for those people, and that can go up and down uh, depending on the amount of people that are in the retired age category and their length of living. And currently, the baby boomers are almost all retired, but that has exploded. That mandatory spending has exploded over the last decade or so as the baby boomers get older. Then we have discretionary spending. And this is not something that the federal government is legally obligated to pay. These are things that can be cut in any given budget cycle, and the law doesn't have to be changed. Then, as we'll talk about extensively, the federal government has been operating at a budget deficit for the most of the last 50 or so years, with a couple of years off with surpluses in the 90s. And whenever you borrow, you have to pay interest on the money that you borrow. So every year, as we kind of push the debt up, it's about $36 trillion right now. We end up having to pay interest on that debt. Now, to be honest with you, that really is a form of mandatory spending. If the federal government were to default on its debt, there would be very serious implications for markets worldwide and the credit of the United States. So while net interest is not included in mandatory spending, one could think of it as being mandatory spending. And then finally, how do we pay for that? And that is revenues, which we'll get to in a future module. So here's the most recent full budget cycle year from 2024. As you can see here, during that year, again, October 1st to September 30th, we had total federal outlays of $6.8 trillion. And as you can see, there's a substantial deficit there because we only brought in revenues of 4.9 million. Now, what's interesting is you take a look at that, and the overwhelming majority of that money goes to mandatory spending. And we'll take a look at those categories in the next slide. And discretionary spending is relatively limited. In fact, it's currently about the size of the federal budget deficit. And then finally, net interest on the debt is about $900 billion for this year. So what we see here is that a sizable portion of the federal budget is actually pretty much on autopilot. All right. So let's take a look at what that means when we talk about the mandatory, discretionary, and net interest. So the way that we divide this up, the two biggest, or actually three biggest programs are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So, Medicare is our payment for older Americans for their health care. Medicaid is for people of lower income, and also generally quite a few old people as well. And when you combine those two programs together, it's equivalent almost to about what we pay on Social Security, right? So those are all three very popular programs in the United States, and they take up a large source of the budget. Then we have our discretionary funding, and we divide that up into defense versus non-defense. And what you can see here is that non-defense accounts for about half funds and defense for the other half. Now, what's interesting is you look at this. Defense which is one of the biggest categories in the federal budget, is $850 billion a year. We are now spending $881 billion a year on net interest for loans for the budget deficit. So just to finance our deficit, are spending in this country as much money on interest as we are for our entire defense budget. Now, when we look at this, what we see is there's been a fairly large change in some of these mandatory outlays. So what you really see the big changes in are major healthcare programs, kind of an explosion of cost in relationship uh, to to, uh, to to having many older people in the United States, and we've expanded coverage significantly during the 2020s, particularly after Obamacare was passed, and states have expanded Medicaid. Social Security also is increasing as a percentage of our GDP as a consequence of the fact that we have, again, more older people are retiring. The baby boom is in full swing at retirement age. What we see is that there's not been a very big increase in the size of expenditures for income security programs, which go towards things that we would typically call things like welfare. Now, one thing that was not included in that is interest on the debt as a percentage of our gross domestic product. And as you can see from this chart, we had exploding budget deficits in the 1980s up to 1990. And we saw some kind of fiscal discipline in the early years of the Clinton administration. And we also saw kind of the end of the Cold War, where we had kind of this defense bonus or peace bonus, as they called it. And we're actually able to pull the amount of money that is spent on our deficit interest loans down substantially uh, in the late 90s. And then you'll see that there's been this vast explosion in the post-COVID world, in which we are now back up to interest on the debt rising to more than 3% of our gross domestic product. As we take a look at this, I want to focus in on the net interest costs and how they're going to affect the budget in coming years. This is a chart from the Peterson Foundation. As you can see, we're right at about that $900 billion level. However, as we take a look 10 years down, 10 years down the road, we see that the projected costs associated with the net interest on the debt is going to explode. And please note that this does not take into account any changes that may come from Republican tax reform in 2025. So by the time we hit 2035, we can be focused on having about $1.8 trillion a year being spent on interest on the national debt. Right, that would overtake Social Security. Just a quick peon here to see what we actually spend our money on, or where we get the money for all this. Individual taxes are the biggest source of revenue for the federal government. They account for about 50% of all revenue. Payroll taxes, which come in the form of the money that we pay to Social Security and Medicare, and each check that we have, is the second largest source of income. Then corporate taxes and the ever-present other. Now, revenues, oddly enough, don't include borrowing from other people. That would certainly be a substantial chunk of this as well. Taking a look at the debt, we are at about $36 trillion in debt right now, and you can see again how that has exploded in real terms over the last several decades, with a massive increase, particularly after the rather permissive spending policies that we had under both the Trump and the Biden administrations in relationship to COVID and post-COVID spending. Now, in theory, deficit spending isn't that bad, right? Uh, the general Keynesian economics idea is that when you have deficits during bad economic conditions, so that you can use the spending power of the federal government to be able to help encourage economic growth. And then the theory goes that, as economic growth gets better and tax revenue goes up, you'll be able to pay off those deficits and essentially be able to, balance your budget. That is certainly not the way it's worked in practice. In practice, we are very good at spending money in economic downturns, but both parties are to blame for this. As revenue starts to go up, generally Republicans will want to have tax cuts, and Democrats will want to increase spending, or some combination of both. So that leads us with an increasing deficit. Now, who owns that debt? What's interesting here is that 20% of all debt from the US government is actually owned by governments. Most of that is the federal government, but state and local governments also have a large portion of that debt as well. And as a consequence of that, it's almost like borrowing from yourself. So, two-thirds of public debt's held by domestic holders. See that the Federal Reserve System is the biggest owner of debt. But then things like pension funds, insurance companies, state and local governments, um, citizens in other countries. Generally, the U.S. Treasury debt is considered to be pretty much the safest investment you could possibly have in the world, and money flows in because people are willing to trust the federal government. Uh, Now, one of the interesting things is that some people are a bit concerned about that. It's nice that people have confidence in the United States Treasury and the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. But there is some concern about the amount of federal debt that is owned by people who live in other countries. And we can see that it's grown substantially from about 5% in 1970 to 30% in 2024. Now, one of the interesting things is that we talked a little bit about that idea of intra-governmental debt. And the majority of the intra-governmental debt, in other words, either federal, state, or local governments who own federal debt, is at the federal level. And there are all kinds of trust funds that the federal government has. And one of the ways to invest the money from these trust funds is in treasury debt. So what we have is that these different kind of funds actually own, debt owned by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government owns its own debt, which is kind of a circular logic that's sometimes hard to get your head around. One of the biggest kind of owner of this debt in the intergovernmental debt is our Social Security system. Back in the early 1980s, in a forward-thinking move, during the Reagan administration, Democrats and Republicans came together and realized that there would not be enough money to be able to provide baby boomers with Social Security benefits when they retired. So they decided to increase taxes and put that money away for when the baby boomers retired. And as a consequence of that, basically all through these years, we've seen the Social Security Trust Fund kind of increase so that we could pay that back out in future years to older people that were retiring during the baby boom. And what we see is that that additional trust fund money is about ready to run out in about 10 years or so. And then you see other retirement funds and various other federal programs on some of that debt. Now, finally, one of the things that is concerning about the U.S. budget deficit uh, is that it's a chronic problem and it's systemic. But what we see as being a serious fiscal problem is Social Security. So we just talked about the idea that they banked a bunch of money back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s to be able to pay for the baby boomers' retirements, and that's in these trust fund accounts. And what you see here is a view out well into the future of our ability to be able to pay for the guarantees that the federal government has made to people on Social Security. So as you can see, that trust fund is going to run out in about 2035, which means that we will be purely on a pay-as-you-go system at that point in time for Social Security, and there just will not be enough revenue coming in because of a population slump, and as a consequence of that, something's going to have to give, right? And the reality is that studies have been done, and this is from the Social Security Administration as kind of idealized here by the Peter Peterson Foundation, is that in order to be able to give out benefits for people once we hit that slump, we'll have to cut benefits by about 17% starting in 2035. That is, if Congress does nothing in the next couple of years. But in some way, once we reach the end of those kind of trust funds, we're going to hit a fiscal cliff that's going to require either spending for Social Security out of the general fund budget, which is already in a huge deficit, or somehow cutting benefits of a very popular program in the United States, which probably will not be that popular. So this is an overview of the federal budget process and where we're going. It seems a little depressing at points, but maybe we see some legislative action to be able to take care of these problems.